Thank you for the introduction. So welcome to my presentation, Go With The Flow. My name is Claudio Canella. I'm currently a PhD candidate at Graz University of Technology in Austria. If you want to reach out after the talk, please do so via Twitter or by email. So before I want to talk about what I'm actually going to present, I want to present a little bit of motivation. And one thing is that we do see quite a lot of attacks over the years. So here we have the number of CVEs that has been being issued over the years. And as you can see here, in this year, we're already on the way to surpass the values that we have encountered in the previous years. So we do need to find a way how we can mitigate against potential attacks. Typically, we have two different ways that we can do this. So the first thing is obviously when we do have vulnerabilities, we do want to eliminate bugs. Obviously, this is also quite difficult. We haven't been able to do this in like forever. The second thing that we can do is that we can limit the post-exploitation impact of these vulnerabilities once somebody, for instance, an attacker, has gained control of the application. So instead of being able to do whatever they want, they are severely limited in what they can achieve. In this talk, I won't talk about eliminating bugs. I've never done any research in that direction, so instead, I will focus on limiting the post-exploitation impact. Obviously, in the past, there have been several attempts to do this as well. For instance, sandboxing. One very prominent example that has been proposed like 17 years ago or so is control-flow-integrity. Control-flow-integrity has a very simple idea. During static analysis, when we compile the application or using a binary analysis, we extract the control flow of an application. So for instance, here we have a simple abstraction of this where we have several nodes and we extract information that node 1 can transfer control to node 2, which can transfer control to node 4. Node 1 can also transfer control to node 3 and so on. So using static analysis, we extract this information, build a control flow graph, and then instrument our binary with some checks. So before we transition in control flow integrity to a new target, the thing that we do is we simply check, is this a valid transfer or not? So for instance, for our node 3, we know that we can only transfer control to nodes 5 and 6. These can be functions, these can be basic blocks, pretty much everything. So if an attacker now tries to hijack the control of our application, we have this malicious flow to a different node, then CFI will prevent this. However, CFI does have a few limitations. It typically only applies within a single domain. For instance, you can apply CFI to user space, you can apply it to kernel space, but it's very hard to do this in a cross-security domain context. But obviously, this is something that we want to do because pretty much all of our exploits require interactions with the operating system, as it is the privileged entity on our systems. So we need a way to limit the interaction with the operating system. And there's one thing that Linux already provides us, and this is Linux SecComp, the Secure Computing Interface. The idea behind SecComp is quite easy. We check for every single system call whether it is part of a filter or not. If it is not, we simply terminate our application. The typical flow here is this. We have our application. The application itself, you as a developer, you are responsible in identifying what are the system calls that your application requires. And you send them to the kernel to install these filters. For every single system call then, the kernel intercepts the system call, checks with the filters, and if it is not part of the filter, we simply terminate it. Otherwise, we execute the system call and return the result. So this is obviously something quite nice that we can use to limit the post-exploitation impact of an attack. However, SecComp has two limitations in this case. The first one is that we only look at the current system call. We don't have any context information. The second one is that it's quite difficult to apply. Here we have a very simple example of a program. It does nothing else than copy one file, the content of one file to another file. But you as a developer, you are responsible in identifying every single system call that your application uses. Well, this is quite simple in something like this. It's not a large program. It's quite complicated if you think about large, complex applications like servers and so on. So just to give you an idea how many system calls that this application might require, this is the list. And as we can see, it's already quite a lot. And most people, I would assume, would not be able to identify these system calls. So a couple of years ago, we worked on automating this. And we gave a presentation on this back at Black Hat in 2020, Black Hat Asia, together with my colleagues. So we simply automated this discovery of the system calls that your application requires. But when we worked on this, we also had another idea. What if we extend seccomp with not only enforcing a current system call, but this current system call in the context of the previous one? So we try to enforce syscall sequences. And this brings me to what I'm going to present today. And this is our concept of syscall-flow-integrity protection. It takes ideas from CFI and seccomp to enforce the program behavior of an application that is protected through it. SVIP, as we call it, is built upon 3 pillars. Our first pillar is a simple state machine. During static analysis, we extract every single syscall sequence of length 2. Obviously, there are more, other lengths are possible as well, but we focused on only length 2. So we extract these sequences and then try to enforce them. So our application is only able to call syscalls in the sequence as we determined statically, just like we had it in the CFI, but on a different level. However, we try to extend this further to provide even stricter protection. And this is through syscall origins. During the same process, when we extract this information, we also extract the origin of each single system call, generating a mapping from the syscall origin to the system call that it can execute. Obviously, this can be a mapping one-to-one. A single syscall instruction can only execute a single system call, or a single system call instruction can potentially execute multiple system calls. Both of these things we do extract during static analysis in the compilation of the application. However, SVIP would not be anything without our third pillar that actually enforces the information. So we modified the Linux kernel that it can receive the information that we provided and then enforce it, intercept the system call, check, is this a valid transition, is it a valid origin, and if it is, we continue our execution. So this is the 3 pillars that our SVIP builds upon. In this talk, I will mostly focus on the first 2 pillars and less on the third pillar, simply because it's more on the trivial side, this part. So we implemented SVIP in a proof of concept implementation. We called this sysflow. Sysflow consists of 3 parts. It's a compiler, so we modified the LLVM compiler toolchain that performs the extraction of both the syscall sequences and the origins. Then a simple support library. It does nothing else than extract the information, do some adjustments for the syscall offsets, and send it to the kernel. And finally, the third part is our modified Linux kernel, which takes care of the enforcement. The enforcement can be done in various ways. We choose to modify the Linux kernel entirely, but you could also use something like eBPF or something like that. So let's focus a bit on the extraction part. What is the type of information that we extract? We have here a very simple example of just a little bit of code. As we can see, we have a function foo. It takes a parameter. It calls some functions. It has some branches in there as well, and a system call. For us, it is important that we extract several key parts of information. So the thing that we extract is the transitions. So we generate an intra-procedural control flow graph so that we know from where can we go to where, so that we can actually extract the sequences correctly. So we know, for instance, that from line 3 we can transition to line 4 or line 6 and so on. We also have the call targets. So these represent our inter-procedural control flow graph, where we know that at line 2 we're going to call the function scanf, or on line 4 we're going to call printf. And finally, we also extract information of the system calls. So we know at line 06 we are going to call the read system call. We extract all of this information for every single file that we encounter, both if it's a C file, if it's an assembly file, we extract all this information, generate the object file the corresponding object file, and encode all of this information in the object file. So, because only later on we can build our whole control flow graph and the syscall sequences. The second part is more complicated, and it builds upon the first part as well, and this is the syscall offset extraction. First, why do we extract the syscall offset as an offset to the start of the function instead of an absolute address? We simply do this so that we can still use features like address space layout randomization, because we simply don't know the final address once it's being loaded. So what we have here is a simple translation unit. We have a function. We already seen this function before, and we know that it's going to execute a system call. So we use now the information that in the backend of the compiler, we see a system call instruction. We use the information that we have extracted previously and annotate this with a label. So we're going to say, this is in function func and the system call number 39. Because at this point, we don't know the offset of the instruction. There are several key steps of optimization that are going to happen afterwards. Only at the very end, when we generate the symbol table for our object file, can we actually determine the offset. So once we have this symbol table, we simply take the address that is generated for the function and the address generated for our now newly generated label, calculate the difference, annotate it with, add the information of the system call number, and we have the information. So we know our function func is going to call the system call 39, I think it's the get BPID system call, at line 02. However, what we also see here is this unknown offsets, this syscall-CP3. Why do we have this? Syscall-CP is a function that's performing a system call with a checkpoint. So we don't know what the offset is there, because it's in a different translation unit. We don't have this information readily available. But what we do have is the information what the actual system call is. But at one point, we have either seen or will see this function syscall-CP. There we have the opposite problem. Now we know what the offset is, but we don't know what the system call is. So we annotate this information, we say we are in function syscall-CP, and as the number we encode -1. And now we have the unknown syscalls as well. So we know what is the offset there in this function. In the linker, we combine this information to get our final information where we now also know syscall-CP is going to perform the function, the system call 3, I think it's close, at this offset. So let's talk about the state machine generation. And also in this same process, we generate the final information for our syscall offsets. We have all these object files that are now annotated that contain this new section with our information that we extracted. We take all of these object files and throw them into the linker. The linker extracts all of this and generates this huge blob of information, this whole control flow graph, the whole information on system calls, syscall offsets, and so on. But obviously, we need to build the final syscall sequence. We cannot simply use this information because we would severely over-approximate, and we still don't know any interprocedural syscall sequences. So I will briefly illustrate the generation of the state machine using this example. So in the top left, you can see the current function that we are at, and on the top right, you see the information that we have available for this. In the bottom, you see the last system calls that we encountered and the state machine. So our information here tells us that we are encountering a transition to the functions foo1 and foo2. And simply based on the order of the line numbers, we know that we first transition to foo1. So let's do this. We recursively visit our function foo1, we pass all the information to it, and we see that the first thing in this function is a system call open. So we're going to consume this open, add it to the last system calls, but we don't have a previous system call. So this is more or less our initial state. What we then have is a transition to the function bar1. In bar1, we again have a system call read. Now we do have a previous system call. So what we can do is we add in the state machine a transition from open to read. So we have a valid transition there. We then consume it, add it to the last system calls, replace the previous value, and can continue. But we don't have any further information for our function bar1. So we simply return, no further information here as well. So we return again until we are at the main function, where we have now our transition to foo2. And we simply repeat that. We go to foo2, we have our system call first with the open system call, our last system call is read, so we are going to add a transition from read to open. Replace the last system call that we encountered, transition to bar2, and add now a transition from the open system call to the stat system call. So we now know that there are two valid transitions from the open system call. One thing that we also do in this process is that every single time we encounter a function, we add all the system call offsets that we have for this function. So simply at the end of this, once we have returned here to our main function, there's no more information left. We have generated this whole map of syscall origins as well as our syscall sequences. Then we encode this information again in our final binary, link our support library to it, which is responsible for extracting the information. Now that we have launched the application, we also know all the function addresses. We use this information, make the offset adjustment, and finally send it to our kernel for the enforcement. The kernel is very simple. It intercepts a system call. It keeps track of what was the previous system call that I encountered. And once we perform a new system call, it looks up in the information, is the current system call a valid target for the previous system call? So it performs this transition check. Once it passes this, it performs this independent origin check to see whether the system call also originates from a location where it is valid. So this is basically the idea of our concept of SVIP. But the thing that always is of interest, obviously, is the evaluation. What is the performance impact of our tool, of our concept? And as well, the security that we provide. Let's start with the performance. So the first thing we did is we performed this micro benchmark. We simply followed what the Linux kernel developers do as well. We executed the get PPID system call 1 million times. We did this for different setups. So in the first column, we see that we simply used no protection at all. In the second, we compared our implementation to seccomp, and then we benchmarked all the different configurations of our SVIP. So only state checks, only origin checks, and then both of them combined. Obviously, we are slower than no protection at all. Here we have like an average number of 302 compared to 341 in the case of our combined protection. This is to be expected, simply because we have to take a different, we have to perform our checks, but also we have to take a different path into the kernel. There's the kernel calls it the slow path compared to the fast syscall enter path. And this is something that we have in common with seccomp, because we need to intercept the system call. But one thing that we can see is that we outperform seccomp in terms of this micro benchmark that we performed. It's only 7 cycles, but still quite a bit. There's a simple reason why this is the case. seccomp internally uses the CBPF program language to express their filters. It's quite complex, it needs to be interpreted, and this takes quite a bit of an overhead. But micro benchmarks they are nice, they tell you like a raw estimate of the overhead, but usually your application isn't going to perform 1 million system calls of the get PPID system call. It's simply not going to happen within a second. So one thing that we did is we performed this macro benchmark. We looked at several large-scale applications and compiled them with our toolchain. We ran them as well. So then also, obviously, as we can report some performance numbers, we can also say that our system actually works. So this is also like a functional correctness test in itself as well, because we were able, for instance, for a memcached, we ran the whole test suite without any errors. For Nginx, we were able to load a website, connect to it, make 100,000 or 1 million requests without it crashing. And for FFmpeg, we simply converted one file to another file format. One thing that we can see here is that we have a very low overhead. The interesting case here is obviously the combined case, because it provides the most protection. In all cases, we have less than 2% overhead. Even though we perform more checks than seccomp, we provide more security. So even though we do all this, we have quite a nice performance impact that I would say is acceptable for most applications. One thing that I want to point to that I still don't know the answer to it is why in FFmpeg we have this weird case where just checking the state or just checking the syscall location performs worse than when we combine those. I repeated the experiment, I think, like 20 times, and this behavior was always prevalent. And it's still something that I'm looking into it. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure what's the case there. I expected some weird caching behavior there. But obviously the thing that we also want to know about is what is the security benefit of using SVIP for your application? One thing that we can reason with, or that allows us to reason about the provided security of our system, is when we look at the state machine. Here we have several applications that we used in our evaluation, in our research paper that we used. So we simply extracted the state machine for all of these applications and looked at some of the key metrics. There are more metrics in the paper, and just present some of the most important ones here. So let's look at Nginx. Nginx here has the highest number of states with 107. Obviously, this is quite a lot. But one thing that is quite important here is that 107 states is also the number of states or system calls that you would have in a seccomp filter. So it's simply the equivalent there, because it's the number of origins for a system call. And if it's an origin, obviously at one point I'm going to require the system call. So the number here also matches our previous research. So when we did the automated seccomp filter generation, we also arrived at this number, and concurrent work also have this. So I'm pretty confident that this is accurate. One thing with seccomp here is, that is quite important with seccomp. We have 107 states, and we don't enforce any context around them. So every single one of these 107 states can reach every single one of the 107 states. So the number of average transitions in seccomp is 107. In our case, we have a reduction to 74.05. So on average, every single one of these 107 states can reach 74 other system calls. Obviously, this is quite a high number. But compared to seccomp, there's still an improvement by 33 system calls. And we see this also for others. The question obviously is, why do we have such a high number of average transitions? There are certain things that we need to do. So we do over-approximate, just like you do in CFI when we build the control flow graph. Resolution of indirect calls is quite complex. It's an undecidable problem. So we need to over-approximate there, which results in this higher number. Now, I do want you to keep these two numbers, 74 and 107, in mind when we transition to our origin analysis. There we did pretty much the same thing. We looked at these applications, we looked at the total number of offsets within these applications, so the total number of system call instructions, and the number of average offsets that where a system call can occur. Let's look again at Nginx. Here we have 318 system call instructions. When we think about seccomp here again, when we use seccomp, we have our 107 system calls. Every single one of these system calls can originate at any one of these 318 locations. So this is perfect if you think about like a ROP chain. I still have quite a big attack surface. But one thing that we have now with our origin enforcement is we reduce this to 3. So even though we have 107 states, on average, every single one of these system calls can only be executed at 3 locations. This is quite a reduction. We have like a factor 100 less syscall origins as would have been possible with seccomp. And together, I think we have this reduction to 74 possible transitions and the reduction to like on average 3 system call locations. This is quite nice of a security benefit. But let's have a look at our concept in the context of return-oriented programming. Just let me give you a quick primer for those if somebody is not too familiar with return-oriented programming. The idea behind ROP is simply that we use existing code in our application to exploit the program. There are certain reasons why we need to do this. I won't go into too many details here, but the idea then is that we use this existing code by simply jumping to parts of functions, which we call gadgets. These gadgets are typically of a very simple form. They are simply assembler instructions that are followed by return instructions, like we can see here. We pop RDI, we return. We perform a system call, or we return, and then we return. So in a typical exploit, you chain these gadgets together, And the only requirement here is that we override the stack with the addresses of the gadgets, as well as any parameters that we require. A brief illustration. So here we have the stack, we have program code, and we have registers. We have prepared our stack, so we have our return address and the parameters on there. We have the program code as well. So we simply return, perform some ASM instruction, return to the next gadget. There, we now have our pop instructions that are part of our gadget. We pop the two values that we've prepared into the register and return to our syscall instruction. And now we have a working ROP chain that performs a system call that we have specified and with the parameters that we also provided. So obviously this is quite interesting for an attacker. And these gadgets that we have here, they are often unintended. So consider this byte sequence from an Intel processor. You have 05, 5A, 5E, 5F, C3. When we disassemble this is simply an add instruction. So we add a constant value to whatever is in the register. However, if we skip the first byte, then it disassembles to this very nice gadget. So we pop some values and return. And an attacker can do this obviously as well. So they can simply jump to unaligned addresses and to unaligned instructions and perform some computation that they want, even though it is not there intended by the compiler or by the application developer. And this property is due to non-aligned variable with opcodes. Now the syscall instruction itself is quite small. It only has a byte sequence of 0505. So it's very easy to find unaligned syscall instructions. However, when we think about SFIP in the context of these return-oriented programming, we do impose some restrictions on them. So we restrict these ROP chains via syscall origins. So, for instance, unaligned instructions are simply no longer possible because we have never encountered an unaligned syscall instruction in our static analysis because we are the compiler. We have no clue about this at this point. And also potentially shellcode or something like that is also not possible. Second, together with the origins, we also enforce that can say that not every single sequence is possible anymore. So this is also quite a nice reduction. So an attacker must be very careful in the gadgets that are constructed and must have previous knowledge about the possible transitions and the possible origins. So together with this, we can say that SFIP imposes significant constraints on control flow hijacking attacks. However, SFIP is not perfect when it comes to this. We have similar restrictions to limitations as CFI, for instance, as I mentioned, the over-approximation. And this over-approximation leads to something that is called a mimicry attack. In our case, it's not a typical mimicry attack as it is discussed in the literature for intrusion detection systems, but a slightly modified version. But let me briefly discuss the mimicry attacks in the context of intrusion detection systems. Because there we have also used syscall sequences for detecting malicious behavior, but not enforcement as we are using it. So we have this detection policy in our intrusion detection system that from an open system call, if an open system call followed by an FSTAT system call followed by a write system call, if we see this behavior, then we know that something malicious is going on. In a mimicry attack, it is quite simple to evade this detection because an attacker can simply do this. The attacker executes the open system call, then performs some no-op system call. It can be anything. Let's say it's a read system call. Then, after the read system call, the attacker performs the FSTAT system call. And there we could also potentially do another no-op system call. Can also be the read system call again. And then we perform the write system call. The only thing that is necessary for the attacker is that the two, for instance, in this case, the two no-op system calls don't interfere with the actual attack. They are simply there to thwart the detection policy. In our case, it's a little bit different because we don't try to detect malicious behavior. We try to enforce program behavior. But we do have this over-approximation that allows an attacker to do this. When our application, for instance, doesn't have a valid transition from the open system call to the FSTAT system call. But it does have a valid transition from open to our no-op system call, which in turn has a transition to the FSTAT system call. So the attacker, with the knowledge of the syscall sequences, can weave his way through the enforcement, so to reach the final system call that is required in the attack. However, even if an attacker tries to do this, there are still restrictions. So there must be a valid transition between the no-op system call and the source system call. And the no-op system call must execute at the valid target, at the valid origin. If this is not possible, if this is not given, then we will kill the exploit. And this is possible for every single one of these edges. So an attacker with knowledge can find a way, but still we do impose some restrictions on attacks. One thing that I want to point to also is that something that I've done and that I will probably release in the near future, it's work that I've done with my student, and it's more or less to restrict exactly attacks like this. Let's assume we have a simple example here. We have two code locations. We have in location A, we have a function, performs a system call, and then calls the function bar1. Bar1 in turn also performs a system call and returns to our function foo1. Location B does pretty much the same thing. It also performs the same system call, but transitions to a different function. So there we perform a different system call. On the right, we can see here the information that we extract in SVIP. We have the transition, so we know that open, because we've encountered it, can transition to either the read or the stats system call. And we have the origins. We have open can occur at these different locations, and read can occur at these locations, read and stat at these locations. One thing that an attacker now would be possible, because we perform these transition and these origin checks independent of each other, an attacker can simply execute the open system call at our location A and transition to location B and perform the stat system call there if it is required. This would pass both checks because it's a valid transition and both system calls originate from a valid origin. That's why I refer to this implementation of SVIP as coarse-grained SVIP, similar to what you see in CFI, where we have coarse-grained and fine-grained CFI. One thing that I worked with my student on is that we thought that, okay, now that we know that actually in extracting these syscall origins, these syscall transition sequences is possible, let's more finely intertwine these parts. So we came up with this idea of this fine-grained SVIP, where we make the transition check also dependent on the previous origin. So now we have the information that open, when it occurs at the location 0x2, can only transition to the system call read at 0x12. So the transition from this point to this point here is no longer possible. And we've worked on this for quite a while now. We have evaluated it, and it seems to actually do what we intended it to do. So it imposes even more significant restrictions, but at the cost of performance. Now, before I finish my presentation here, I want to point you to our proof of concept. You can find it on GitHub. One thing that I want to point out, it's an academic proof of concept, so there are still restrictions. I'm currently working also on it to make it more easy to use because it's quite difficult right now. But you can find our proof of concept implementation on GitHub, and I'm also working on releasing our more fine-grained solution there as well. If you want more information, so there's obviously not enough time to go into all the details, so you can find more details in our paper. You have all the implementation details where we discuss even potential improvements that are going even further than what we have currently, limitations, a more extensive security discussion. We also demonstrated in our paper how a specific bug would have been prevented if the application would have been protected by SVIP, and you can find it on archive. Now, a brief recap. So with SVIP, we do provide this integrity to user kernel transitions that we were not able to do directly with CFI and also not directly with SecComp. We were also able to provide security via our syscall transitions and our origin checks. And one thing that I also want to point out, similar to our automated SecComp filter generation, it is fully automized. It does not require any action by the developer except adding like compiler flags. Otherwise, it's fully automated, and it has minimal runtime overhead of less than 2%, as we have seen. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.